The world as your great-great-grandparents knew it. It got flipped, spun, and remade, and fast. We are talking about the Industrial Revolution, a period roughly from the 1760s to the 1840s, and then stretching its mighty arms well into the late 1800s. It was not just about steam engines and new machines. It was about how everyday people lived, worked, and, yes, how they navigated being single. Before this time, life for an unmarried person was often very mapped out, usually lived within a small community under the watchful eyes of family. Then came the factories, the booming cities, and a whole new set of circumstances. Imagine millions, literally millions of people moving from quiet villages to bustling, anonymous urban centers. For instance, Manchester in England saw its population multiply over 10 times in just a century, from around 17,000 in 1760 to over 180,000 by 1830. Many of these new city dwellers were young and unmarried, drawn by the promise of work. In some textile mills, it was common to find that more than half the workforce was under the age of 20. The very age people decided to marry started to change, creeping upwards in many industrialized nations. And for single women, the chance to earn their own wage, however small, opened up a different kind of life full of new possibilities and new challenges. This is not just a story of inventions. It is the story of how being single was reinvented. Number 9. Your ancestors ditched the farm for the big city, and single life got wild. Before the Great Shift, the vast majority of people in countries like England or the United States lived in rural areas. Think small villages, tight-knit communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. For a single person, this meant life was often predictable. Your family, your church, and local customs heavily influenced who you might meet, court, and eventually marry. Opportunities for work outside the family farm or a local craft were limited, especially for single women. Social life revolved around community events, festivals, and church gatherings. Anonymity was a rare commodity. Then the engines of industry began to roar, and their sound was like a siren song calling people to new urban centers. Between 1750 and 1850, the percentage of the population in England living in cities went from about 15% to over 50%. This was a monumental uprooting. Cities like London, Liverpool, Manchester in England, or New York and Philadelphia in the United States swelled at rates never seen before. Manchester, a hub of textile manufacturing, grew from a modest town of around 17,000 people in the mid-1700s to a bustling city of over 70,000 by 1801, and then to a staggering 300,000 by 1851. This was not just growth, it was an explosion. So, what did this mean for a single person? Imagine a young man or woman, perhaps in their late teens or early 20s, packing their few belongings and leaving the only home they had ever known. They were heading towards the smoke, the noise, and the promise of wages in a factory or a workshop. For many, this was a journey into the unknown. Once they arrived, they found themselves in a world vastly different from the quiet fields and familiar faces of their village. The sheer number of people was overwhelming. Streets were crowded, noisy, and often filthy. In these burgeoning cities, a single person could experience a new kind of freedom. Anonymity. No longer was every action scrutinized by neighbors or family members. This could be liberating. You could, to some extent, reinvent yourself, try out new behaviors, or simply exist without constant oversight. This urban migration brought single people into contact with a much wider array of individuals than they would have ever encountered in their rural villages. People from different regions, with different accents. The pool of potential partners, at least in theory, expanded enormously. However, This new urban environment also brought significant challenges. Loneliness was a real issue. Despite being surrounded by thousands, a newcomer could feel incredibly isolated, cut off from the support systems of family and community. The work that drew them to the cities was often grueling. Factory hours were long, typically 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. Conditions were frequently dangerous and unhealthy. This left little time or energy for socializing or pursuing relationships. The living conditions for many newly arrived single workers were often dire. They crowded into poorly built tenements or lodging houses. A single room might be shared by several people, sometimes strangers, offering little privacy or comfort. Disease spread rapidly in these unsanitary, overcrowded conditions. Cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis were rampant in many industrial cities. For a single person far from family support, falling ill could be a catastrophe. Crime was also a significant concern in these rapidly growing, often poorly policed urban areas. Newcomers, unfamiliar with city ways, could be easy targets. Yet, amidst the hardship, new forms of social life began to emerge, specifically catering to or utilized by this growing population of urban singles. Even the streets themselves, the markets, and the public squares became places of informal congregation and interaction. The sheer density of young, unmarried people living and working in close proximity meant that encounters, fleeting or otherwise, were inevitable. This was a fundamental shift from the more structured and supervised social interactions of rural life. The city offered a different kind of stage for the drama of single life, one with more actors, more diverse scripts, and a much larger, more unpredictable audience. The move to the city was not just a change of scenery for single people. It was a profound alteration in the very fabric of their existence, their opportunities, and the daily realities they faced. For example, records from the period show a significant increase in what were termed irregular relationships or cohabitations. In urban centers, something much harder to conceal or sustain in a small village. The city, for all its dangers, provided a cloak of anonymity that could allow for different kinds of personal lives to unfold, far from the judgment of a small community. This change set the stage for many other transformations in how single life would be lived and perceived. Number 8. The factory whistle ruled romance. How work changed for yeens. Before the widespread mechanization of industry, work for most single people was deeply intertwined with family and community. Young men might learn a trade as an apprentice, often living with their master's family, or work on the family farm. Young women's work was typically domestic, centered around the household, assisting their mothers, or working as domestic servants in other households, again often living in. The rhythm of work was often dictated by daylight, hours, seasons, and specific tasks, rather than the relentless ticking of a clock. There was a degree of integration between work and social life. The Industrial Revolution dramatically altered this landscape of labor, particularly for the burgeoning population of single individuals flocking to towns and cities. The most iconic symbol of this new era of work was the factory, and the factory had its own master, the clock and the machine. Work in a textile mill, a coal mine, or an iron foundry was characterized by its relentless pace, long hours, and often dehumanizing conditions. Typical workdays started early, often before sunrise, and ended late, long after sunset. 12 to 16-hour shifts were common for 6 days a week. The 1833 Factory Act in Britain, one of the first attempts at regulation, limited hours for children aged 9 to 13 to 8 hours a day, and for those aged 14 to 18 to 12 hours a day. That these were considered reforms speaks volumes about the prior conditions. For adult singles, these long hours were the norm. What did this mean for a single person's life, outside of work, especially their ability to form or maintain relationships? The sheer exhaustion was a major factor. After a grueling day tending machines in a deafeningly loud and often dangerously hot or humid factory, there was little energy left for socializing, courtship, or leisure. Time itself became a scarce commodity. The short period between finishing work and needing to sleep was often consumed by basic necessities like obtaining and preparing food, and perhaps washing, if facilities were even available. Courtship, which traditionally might have involved leisurely walks, visits to family homes, or community gatherings, had to be squeezed into very small windows of opportunity, if at all. The nature of factory work also changed social interactions. While many single people worked alongside each other, the environment was not always conducive to forming deep connections. The noise of machinery often made conversation difficult. The work was often monotonous and physically demanding, requiring intense focus to avoid accidents. Supervision was strict, and factory discipline was harsh. There was little room for the playful banter or casual interactions that might occur in a more traditional work setting. However, the factory and the workplace did, by necessity, become a new sphere for meeting potential partners. With so many young, unmarried people working together, attractions were bound to form. These workplace romances, however, had to be navigated carefully, often in secret, under the eyes of overseers or disapproving fellow workers. The wages earned, while a primary motivator for moving to industrial centers, also played a complex role in the lives of single workers. For single men, a factory wage, however meager, might offer the prospect of eventually being able to support a family, a key step towards marriage. However, wages were often so low and employment so precarious that this prospect could seem distant. For single women, earning an independent wage was a newer phenomenon. In textile mills, for example, women and children formed a significant portion of the workforce. Their wages were almost always lower than men's, often justified by the assumption that they were only supplementing a family income or were working temporarily until marriage. Yet, even a small independent income could offer a degree of autonomy. It might mean not being solely dependent on family, or having a bit more say in personal decisions, including those about relationships. But it also meant they were often seen as cheap labor. For instance, in 1833, female cotton spinners in Manchester earned on average about 8 shillings a week, while male spinners could earn over 20 shillings. The separation of work from the home was another profound change. In pre-industrial societies, work and living spaces were often the same, or very close. The Industrial Revolution created a clear demarcation. The home and the workplace became separate spheres. This journey to and from work, the daily commute, however short or long, also became a part of life, and sometimes an opportunity for social interaction among singles. The shared experience of harsh working conditions could also foster a sense of camaraderie and solidarity among workers, which could sometimes extend into social relationships outside the factory gates. Unions and worker societies began to form, and these also became new avenues for social connection, though often male-dominated. The relentless demands of industrial labor reshaped the temporal and spatial contours of single life, limiting opportunities for traditional courtship, while simultaneously creating new, if challenging, contexts. The factory whistle did not just signal the start and end of the workday. It profoundly influenced when, where, and how single people could even attempt to connect with one another. Number 7. Suddenly, single women were earning cash, and it changed everything. In the era before widespread industrialization, the economic roles of single women were generally clearly defined and often limited. Most unmarried women lived and worked within the context of a family household, their parents, relatives, or as a domestic servant in another family's home. Their labor, whether in domestic chores, agriculture, or cottage industries like spinning or weaving at home, was crucial, but often unpaid in direct wages, or if paid, the sums were small and control over them limited. Marriage was, for many women, the primary path to economic security, such as it was. The concept of a single woman as an independent economic agent was not widespread. The Industrial Revolution began to chip away at this established order, though not always in straightforward or universally positive ways. The rise of factories, particularly textile mills, created a new demand for labor, and employers quickly realized that women and children could be hired for lower wages than men. Suddenly, opportunities for single women to earn their own cash income, independent of direct family oversight or domestic service, expanded significantly. In the early 19th century, women and girls formed a large percentage of the workforce in textile factories in places like Lowell, Massachusetts, or Manchester, England, for example. By the 1830s, women comprised nearly 75% of the workforce in the Lowell textile mills. These mill girls were often young, single women from rural areas, drawn by the prospect of wages. This newfound ability to earn money had profound implications for single women's lives. Firstly, it offered a measure of economic independence, however modest. A wage meant the ability to pay for one's own board and lodging, to buy clothes, or even to save a little money. For some, it meant being able to send money back to their families, contributing to the household economy in a new way. This economic contribution could sometimes translate into a slightly greater say within the family, or a degree of personal freedom. Secondly, the experience of working outside the home in a structured industrial environment and living among peers, often in company-run boarding houses, was a significant departure from the more isolated or family-centered existence of the past. These boarding houses, while often strictly regulated, became communities of young women, fostering friendships and shared experiences. However, this economic opportunity came at a considerable cost. As mentioned, women's wages were consistently lower than men's for comparable or even identical work. In Britain, in the mid-19th century, women in factories typically earned half to two-thirds of what men earned. The justification was often that women were not the primary breadwinners and that their work was temporary until marriage. Working conditions were frequently appalling. Long hours, dangerous machinery, poor ventilation, and constant noise. The work was physically demanding and monotonous. The newfound economic independence was thus often bought with significant physical and mental strain. Beyond the factory, opportunities for single women to earn also expanded in other sectors, although often with similar downsides. Domestic service remained the largest employer of women, and many single women continued to work as maids, cooks, and nannies. While offering room and board, wages were low, hours incredibly long, and personal freedom severely restricted. The rise of cities also created more opportunities in areas like dressmaking, millinery, and laundry services. These were often piece-rate jobs done in small workshops or at home, characterized by intense competition and very low pay. For example, a seamstress in London in the 1840s might work 16 to 18 hours a day during busy seasons for a wage that barely covered subsistence. The very fact that single women were earning their own money, and in some cases living independently, challenged existing social norms and gender roles. Some contemporary observers worried about the moral implications of young women living away from family supervision, fearing for their virtue in the anonymous environment of the city. Others saw it as a threat to the traditional family structure. Yet, for many single women, the ability to earn was empowering, even if the conditions were harsh. It offered an alternative, however imperfect, to early marriage or complete dependence on male relatives. It could delay marriage, as a woman might choose to work for a few years to save money or simply to experience a different kind of life before settling down. For example, historical studies of marriage registers from industrial towns sometimes show a slightly later average age of first marriage for women compared to rural areas, partly attributable to these work opportunities. This era also saw the beginnings of a discourse around women's right to work and fair wages, although these movements would take many decades to gain significant traction. The experience of working collectively, even in oppressive conditions, laid some groundwork for future labor activism among women. The shift was not a simple story of liberation. It was complex, filled with exploitation and hardship, but it undeniably altered the economic landscape for single women, giving them a new, albeit often precarious, foothold in the wage economy. This in turn affected their social standing, their choices regarding marriage and family, and their very sense of self as individuals in a rapidly changing world. The cash in a single woman's hand, however little, represented a subtle but significant crack in the old patriarchal order. Number 6. No more mom and dad. Where unmarried folks actually live. Before the Industrial Revolution, the living arrangements for most unmarried individuals were fairly straightforward and usually involved living with family. Young adults typically resided in their parental home until marriage. If they worked outside the immediate family farm or business, such as an apprentice or a domestic servant, they often lived in their employer's household, which essentially became a substitute family environment. Privacy was limited, and behavior was closely monitored by family members or employers. The idea of a young, single person living truly independently was uncommon, especially for women. The massive migration to industrial cities during the Industrial Revolution shattered these traditional housing patterns for hundreds of thousands of single people. When young men and women left their rural homes to seek work in factories and workshops, they needed places to live, and the existing housing stock in rapidly expanding cities was often woefully inadequate. This led to the rise of new, and often challenging, types of accommodation specifically for, or heavily utilized by, single workers. One of the most common solutions was the boarding house or lodging house. These establishments varied greatly in size and quality, from relatively respectable homes run by landladies who rented out a few rooms, to overcrowded and squalid tenements where multiple lodgers might share a single room, sometimes even sleeping in shifts in the same bed never had a chance to cool down. For a single person newly arrived in the city, finding a room in a lodging house was often the first order of business. Prices varied, but typically, a worker would spend a significant portion of their weekly wages on rent. For example, in mid-19th century London, a single room or a share of one could cost several shillings a week, a substantial sum when wages might only be 10 to 20 shillings. Life in these lodging houses was a world away from the family home. Privacy, rooms were often small, poorly ventilated, and lacking in basic sanitation. Overcrowding was the norm. A single house might be packed with dozens of lodgers. These conditions contributed to the rapid spread of diseases. Yet, these houses also became social hubs of a sort. Lodgers, often young and single like themselves, formed new kinds of communities. They shared meals, stories, and experiences of city life and factory work. Friendships, and sometimes romantic relationships, blossomed in these close quarters. For better or worse, the lodging house became a key institution in the social world of the urban single. Some employers, particularly in the early model factory, towns like Lowell, Massachusetts, established company-owned boarding houses specifically for their female workers. These were often strictly supervised by matrons, with rules governing curfew, visitors, and general conduct. While providing a degree of safety and ensuring a stable workforce for the mills, These regulations also limited the personal freedom of the young women living there. For example, the Lowell Mill girls lived in dormitories where attendance at church was often mandatory, and behavior was closely monitored to maintain the company's reputation. For single men, options might also include rougher lodging houses, sometimes called doss houses, which offered very cheap, basic shelter, perhaps just a spot on the floor. Some men, particularly those in itinerant trades or newly arrived and unable to find other accommodation, might even resort to sleeping in sheds, doorways, or other makeshift shelters. The instability of employment in many industries meant that the threat of homelessness was very real for many single workers. If they lost their job, they could quickly lose their lodging. The sheer anonymity of city life also meant that some single individuals could choose to live in unconventional arrangements, such as unmarried couples cohabiting. While this was still socially frowned upon and carried risks, particularly for women, the lack of close community oversight in large cities made it more possible than in a small village. Census records from the period sometimes hint at these arrangements, though they were often concealed. This shift in living arrangements had a profound impact on single life. It meant a separation from the direct influence and support of family. While this could offer freedom, it also brought vulnerability. Sickness, unemployment, or other personal crises had to be faced alone, or with the help of fellow lodgers or co-workers, rather than family. The lack of private space also impacted courtship. Inviting a potential partner home was often not an option. Or, if it was to a crowded public feeling room. This pushed courtship further into public spaces like parks, pubs, or dance halls. The change from living under a family roof or an employer's roof that functioned like one to living in a rented room surrounded by strangers or acquaintances fundamentally altered the experience of being single. It created a new social landscape, one characterized by greater independence but also greater insecurity, and the need to forge new kinds of social networks for survival and companionship. Number 5. I got a later start. Date thanks to the machine age. In many pre-industrial Western societies, the age at which people married was often influenced by economic factors, particularly the ability to establish an independent household. For men, this usually meant having land to farm or a trade to practice. For women, while their economic contribution was vital, their marriage timing was often linked to that of their chosen partner. There was a general pattern, though it varied by region and social class, but often people married in their early to mid-20s. Sometimes, if economic conditions were harsh, marriages might be delayed, but the overall expectation was that adulthood and marriage went hand in hand. The Industrial Revolution introduced a complex set of new factors that began to subtly and then more noticeably alter marriage patterns, including the average age at which people, especially singles, chose to tie the knot. One of the most significant changes was the shift from a land-based economy to a wage-based economy for large segments of the population. In the old system, a young man might have to wait to inherit land or complete a long apprenticeship before he could afford to marry and support a family. In the new industrial system, a wage, even a meager one, could be earned from a younger age. This might initially suggest that people could marry earlier. However, other factors complicated this picture. Industrial wages were often low and employment was frequently insecure. Cost of living in rapidly growing cities could be high. While a young person could earn money, saving enough to set up a household and support a family was a significant challenge. This economic uncertainty could lead individuals or couples to postpone marriage. They might wait until they had accumulated some savings or until the man felt his job was more stable. Historical demographic studies, looking at parish records and census data from the 18th and 19th centuries in industrializing nations like England, show a trend towards a gradual increase in the average age of first marriage for both men and women in many areas, particularly in the later phases of the Industrial Revolution. For example, in England and Wales, the average age of first marriage for women rose from around 23-24 in the early 18th century to around 25-26 by the late 19th century. For men, the shift was similar, often remaining a couple of years older than women. For single women, the new opportunities to earn wages in factories or other urban employment also played a role. As discussed earlier, having an independent income, however small, could reduce the immediate economic pressure to marry. A young woman might choose to work for several years, contributing to her natal family's income, saving for a dowry. Though formal dowries were becoming less common among the working classes, some personal savings were still desirable, or simply enjoying a period of relative independence before taking on the responsibilities of marriage and child-rearing. The experience of living and working with other young women in a city environment could also broaden her horizons and perhaps make her more selective in her choice of a partner. Furthermore, the migration to cities and the disruption of traditional community structures meant that the social pressures to marry young, while still present, might have been somewhat diffused. In a village, an unmarried person in their late 20s might be an object of comment. In a large, anonymous city, there was less direct community scrutiny. This is not to say the desire for marriage disappeared, far from it, but the timeline could become more flexible. The changing nature of work and life also brought new considerations. The harsh conditions of factory labor and urban living took a toll on health. Infant and child mortality rates were high in many industrial cities. Couples might delay having children and perhaps marriage itself until they felt more economically secure or had better living conditions, though this was a luxury many could not afford. It is important to note that these trends were not uniform across all social classes or regions. Among the middle and upper classes, who were also affected by the societal shifts of the Industrial Revolution, different considerations might influence marriage age. For them, education, career, establishment for men, and finding a partner of suitable social standing could lead to later marriages. However, for the large numbers of single people caught up in the wave of industrialization, the decision of when to say "I do" became increasingly tied to the volatile realities of urban wage labor, the cost of city living, and the new, albeit limited, economic roles opening up. The Industrial Revolution did not stop people from marrying, but it did subtly redraw the timetable for many, pushing the starting line for married life a bit further down the road of young adulthood. This delay, in turn, extended the period of singlehood for many individuals. Number 4. Forget the village green. New hangouts for singles popped up everywhere. In the days before the big industrial boom, social life for single people, especially when it came to meeting potential partners, was often centered around familiar, community-sanctioned spaces. Think of the village green, church gatherings, local fairs, harvest festivals, or chaperoned visits to family homes. Interactions were generally public, within sight of family and neighbors, and often followed established social protocols. Privacy for courtship was scarce. The Industrial Revolution, with its massive urbanization and the concentration of young unmarried workers in cities, completely revolutionized where and how singles could meet and socialize. The old rural gathering spots were replaced or supplemented by a host of new urban venues, some respectable, some less so, but all playing a role in the evolving social lives of single men and women. One of the most prominent new social centers was the public house or pub. Pubs proliferated in industrial cities, serving as a refuge from cramped living quarters and grueling factory work. For many single working-class men, the pub was a home away from home, a place to relax, drink, smoke, play games, and importantly, socialize with peers. While primarily male domains, some pubs had separate rooms or sections where women might also gather, or where men and women could interact, particularly in the evenings or on weekends. Pubs were noisy, lively, and largely free from the kind of oversight found in more traditional settings. They became crucial meeting places where friendships were forged, news was exchanged, and yes, romantic connections sometimes began. For example, in 19th century London, it was estimated there was one pub for every few hundred people in some working-class districts. Another key development was the rise of new forms of commercial entertainment that provided spaces for singles to mingle. Dance halls and music halls became immensely popular. These venues offered affordable entertainment, music, dancing, comedy acts, and an environment where young men and women could meet and interact with a degree of freedom previously unimaginable. The dance hall, in particular, was a prime location for courtship. The physical closeness of dancing, the excitement of the music, and the relatively anonymous crowd created a charged atmosphere. While some moral reformers decried these places as dens of iniquity, for many young singles they were exhilarating spaces of possibility. Records show that by the late 19th century, large cities boasted numerous dance palaces, attracting thousands of young people each week. Parks and public promenades also took on new significance. As cities grew, civic planners began to create more public green spaces. On Sundays, their one day off, or in the evenings during summer, these parks would be filled with people seeking fresh air and recreation. For single people, a stroll in the park offered a respectable way to see and be seen, to meet acquaintances, or to engage in quiet conversation with a potential romantic interest, away from the prying eyes of landladies or factory foremen. Keep excursions, made possible by the expanding railway network, to seaside resorts or countryside spots, also became popular outings for groups of young singles, offering further opportunities for socializing outside the confines of the city. The streets themselves became important social arenas. In crowded urban neighborhoods, much of life was lived outdoors. People congregated on street corners, in marketplaces, or simply promenaded along busy thoroughfares. These everyday encounters, while fleeting, increased the chances of meeting new people. The rise of shops with attractive window displays also encouraged window shopping as a leisure activity, bringing people out onto the commercial streets. Even the workplace, as restrictive as it often was, became an unavoidable site of social interaction among singles, simply due to the concentration of young people. Friendships and romances often developed over shared tasks or during brief breaks, despite the challenging conditions. Furthermore, new associations and clubs began to emerge. Workers' societies, friendly societies, providing mutual aid, religious groups, and recreational clubs, these all provided additional avenues for single people with shared interests to meet and connect. These new urban hangouts represented a significant shift. Social life for singles became more commercialized, more anonymous, and often less supervised. This offered new freedoms, but also new anxieties. Without the familiar social structures of the village, navigating these new spaces required a different set of social skills. For young women in particular, there were concerns about reputation and safety in these more public and mixed environments. Yet, the allure of these new spaces was undeniable. They offered excitement, novelty, and most importantly, the chance to meet a wider range of potential partners than ever before, fundamentally reshaping the landscape of courtship and single social life. The village green was replaced by the gas-lit street, the crowded dance hall, and the bustling pub, each a new stage for the age-old pursuit of connection. Number 3. The great single lady debate that shook society. Before the major societal upheavals of the Industrial Revolution, The position of an adult unmarried woman, often termed a spinster, was relatively unambiguous, if not always enviable. In a society where women's primary roles were seen as wife and mother, remaining single long-term was often viewed as a misfortune or a deviation from the norm. Single women typically lived under the care and authority of male relatives, fathers, brothers, or uncles, or as dependents in other households. While some single women found fulfilling roles as aunts, caregivers, or contributors to family enterprises, their social and economic status was largely defined by their lack of a husband. The Industrial Revolution, however, brought demographic and social changes that thrust the figure of the single woman into a new and often contentious spotlight, particularly in the mid to late 19th century. One of the most significant factors was a demographic imbalance that became apparent in countries like Britain. Census data began to reveal what was termed the surplus women phenomenon, a noticeable numerical excess of women over men in the marriageable age groups. For example, the 1851 census in Great Britain showed approximately 365,000 more adult women than men. This imbalance was attributed to various factors, including higher male mortality rates, men emigrating to colonies or other countries in greater numbers than women, and men serving in the military abroad. This demographic reality sparked a widespread public debate and considerable social anxiety. If marriage was the expected destiny for women, what was to become of these surplus women who statistically might never find husbands? This question was endlessly discussed in newspapers, journals, sermons, and books. The term redundant women was even used by some commentators, reflecting a societal unease with women who did not fit neatly into the wife-mother category. The debate was multifaceted. Some argued that the surplus of unmarried women was a serious social problem, leading to poverty, moral decline, and female frustration. Solutions proposed ranged from encouraging female emigration to the colonies, where men supposedly outnumbered women, to promoting a more spiritual or altruistic role for single women in society, such as charitable work or teaching. Others, however, began to challenge the traditional view that marriage was the only acceptable path for women. Early feminists and social reformers started to argue for better education and more employment opportunities for women, so that single women could lead fulfilling and economically independent lives. They pointed out that many single women were already supporting themselves and contributing to society despite significant barriers. The economic changes of the Industrial Revolution were also central to this debate. As discussed, new, albeit often poorly paid, employment opportunities opened up for women in factories, shops, and, increasingly, in new white-collar jobs like teaching, nursing, popularized by figures like Florence Nightingale after the Crimean War in the 1850s, and clerical work towards the end of the 19th century. The existence of a growing number of single women earning their own living, however modest, began to challenge the notion that women were solely dependents. These working single women, whether by choice or necessity, were a visible testament to an alternative female life path. The single lady, no longer just a quiet spinster in a relative's home, but potentially an urban worker, a teacher, a nurse, or a writer, became a more complex and public figure. Literary representations of single women also began to change, moving beyond simple caricatures to explore their inner lives, struggles, and aspirations. Think of characters in novels by authors like Jane Austen, though earlier, her characters often still focused on marriage, or later, the Bronte sisters, whose heroines often grappled with issues of independence and societal expectations. This societal debate about single women also touched upon issues of female suffrage and legal rights. If women could be economically independent and contribute to society as single individuals, why should they be denied political and legal personhood? The concerns and discussions around surplus women inadvertently fueled some of the arguments for greater female emancipation. The visibility of so many competent, self-supporting single women made it harder to argue that women were inherently incapable of functioning outside the domestic sphere. So, while the term surplus women might sound alarming or demeaning to modern ears, the debate it sparked was a crucial moment in rethinking the role and status of unmarried women. It forced society to confront the reality that not all women would marry, and that single women were not a monolithic group to be pitied or ignored, but a significant and evolving part of the social fabric. The Industrial Revolution, by altering demographics and creating new economic realities, inadvertently pushed the single lady question to the forefront, prompting a re-evaluation of what it meant to be an unmarried woman in a changing world. This debate did not resolve all the issues, far from it, but it did crack open the door to new possibilities and perceptions for single women. Number 2, finding the one got a makeover. Goodbye, chaperones? Before the Industrial Revolution swept through societies, the process of finding a spouse courtship was often a highly structured and community-regulated affair. For many, especially in the propertied classes, marriages were less about romantic love and more about alliances between families, consolidation of land, or economic partnerships. Even among the less affluent, parental approval and community sanction were usually vital. Young couples rarely spent significant time alone. Chaperones, an older married woman, a family member, or a trusted servant, were commonplace, especially for young women of the middle and upper classes, to ensure propriety and prevent any scandal. Courtship often involved formal visits, supervised social gatherings, and a clear progression of steps towards engagement and marriage. The Industrial Revolution, with its massive social and geographical dislocations, began to unravel many of these long-held traditions. The move to cities, the anonymity of urban life, the separation from immediate family oversight, and the emergence of new social spaces all contributed to a significant makeover in how single people met and formed relationships. While chaperones did not disappear overnight, especially in more affluent or conservative circles, their universal presence began to wane, particularly among the working classes in bustling urban environments. One of the biggest changes was the increased opportunity for individual choice in selecting a partner. With young people living and working away from their families, parental influence over spousal selection, while still important, lessened. Young men and women met as individuals in factories, lodging houses, pubs, and dance halls, and attractions were more likely to be based on personal preference, physical attraction, or shared experiences rather than family strategy. The idea of romantic love as the primary basis for marriage, which had been gaining currency since the 18th century, found fertile ground in this new urban landscape. Popular songs, cheap novels, and theatrical melodramas, all increasingly accessible, often celebrated romantic love and individual choice, further shaping aspirations. The spaces where courtship occurred also changed. As mentioned earlier, public venues like dance halls, parks, and even crowded streets became common places for couples to meet and spend time together. This public courtship was a departure from the more private, home-based rituals of the past. A couple might go for a walk, attend a public entertainment, or meet for a drink. While these encounters were public, they often offered more freedom from direct supervision than a formal visit to the young woman's parlor with her parents present. For example, records from the era described the popularity of walking out together on a Sunday afternoon as a common courtship activity for working-class couples. However, this greater freedom also came with new risks and anxieties. Without the close guidance and protection of family, young women in particular could be vulnerable to exploitation or social censure if a courtship did not lead to marriage or if perceived proprieties were breached. The concept of reputation remained incredibly important. A young woman's future marriage prospects could be severely damaged by rumors or perceived indiscretions. This tension between new freedoms and old constraints characterized courtship in the industrial era. The very pace of courtship might also have changed for some. In a village, relationships might develop slowly over years as individuals knew each other from childhood. In the city, with its transient populations and the intensity of urban life, courtships could be shorter and more intense. The desire for companionship and security in an often harsh urban environment might also encourage quicker attachments. Communication methods in courtship also saw subtle shifts. While face-to-face interaction remained paramount, the rise of cheap postage in the mid-19th century, like the penny post introduced in Britain in 1840, made letter writing more accessible. For couples separated by distance, or even for those in the same city wanting to express sentiments more privately, letters became an important tool of courtship. Literacy rates were gradually increasing, making this form of communication more viable for a broader segment of the population. It is crucial to understand that these changes were not uniform. Middle and upper-class courtship rituals often remained more formal and supervised for longer. Concerns about property, lineage, and social standing meant that parental involvement and adherence to strict codes of conduct were still paramount. The marriage market for these classes, with its seasons, balls, and introductions, continued, albeit with its own adaptations to modern life. However, for the rapidly growing working classes and even for segments of the lower middle class, the Industrial Revolution fostered an environment where courtship became more individualized, more public, and more reliant on personal attraction and negotiation between the two individuals involved. The iron hand of the chaperone was slowly being replaced by the more invisible, but no less powerful forces of urban anonymity and emerging ideals of romantic self-determination. The path to finding the one was becoming a more personal journey, albeit one navigated through a landscape full of new opportunities and new perils. Number 1. Being unmarried stopped being just one thing. In the societies existing before the great wave of industrialization, the status of being unmarried was, for adults, generally perceived as a temporary state, a waiting period, before entering the normative state of matrimony. For women, spinsterhood, if prolonged, often carried connotations of being unwanted, unfortunate, or dependent. For men, prolonged bachelorhood might be seen as somewhat eccentric or irresponsible, a shirking of the duties of establishing a family and household, though it often carried less social stigma than spinsterhood. Essentially, unmarried was largely defined by its lack. The lack of a spouse, the lack of a certain social standing. The Industrial Revolution, with its profound economic, social, and demographic shifts, began to fracture this singular understanding of unmarried status. Being single started to encompass a wider range of experiences, motivations, and social perceptions. It stopped being just one thing and diversified into various forms of singlehood, each with its own context and implications. Firstly, the rise of industrial capitalism and urban centers created a new category of young, mobile single workers. These were the men and women who left their rural homes for jobs in factories, mines, and workshops. For them, being single was often a period of economic striving, of independence, however limited by wages and conditions, and of navigating the new, anonymous urban world. This worker single was a distinct social type, characterized by their participation in the wage economy and their residence in lodging houses or shared accommodation, away from direct family control. Their single status was often a practical necessity for labor mobility and was tied to the economic engine of industrialism. This wasn't necessarily waiting for marriage in the old sense. It was an active phase of life with its own social dynamics. Secondly, as discussed earlier, the phenomenon of surplus women, the demographic imbalance where women outnumbered men in marriageable age groups in some industrialized nations, meant that for a significant number of women, remaining single was not a choice or a temporary phase, but a long-term reality. This led to the emergence of the independent single woman, as a more visible, though often debated, figure. Some of these women carved out careers in new professions like teaching or nursing, or found livelihoods in trades or small businesses. Their singlehood was not defined by waiting, but by active participation in public and economic life. Figures from the late 19th century show increasing numbers of women who never married. For instance, in England and Wales, the proportion of women aged 45–49 who had never married rose from around 12% in 1871 to nearly 16% by 1911. Thirdly, for some men, particularly in the burgeoning middle classes, an extended period of bachelorhood became associated with career building and the accumulation of wealth necessary to maintain a certain standard of living before marriage. Professional bachelor might delay marriage into his 30s or even later, focusing on establishing himself in business, law, medicine, or other professions. This type of singlehood was often viewed with more social acceptance, sometimes even as a mark of ambition or financial prudence. Furthermore, the anonymity and diversity of city life allowed for other, less conventional forms of single or unmarried life to exist, even if not openly acknowledged. Cohabitation without marriage, while still carrying social stigma, became more possible in the crowded, less tightly knit communities of large cities compared to small villages. Individuals might also choose to remain single for personal reasons, finding companionship and fulfillment outside of traditional marriage, even if these choices were rarely articulated or socially validated. The very language and social perception around being unmarried began to show subtle shifts. While terms like spinster and bachelor persisted, the lived experiences they represented were becoming more varied. The single person was no longer just someone not yet married but could be a factory girl sending money home, a determined schoolmistress, a rising young clerk, or an individual navigating the complexities of urban social life on their own terms. The reasons for being single, the duration of singlehood, and the way single life was lived became much more diverse. The Industrial Revolution, therefore, did not just change where single people lived or worked. It fundamentally diversified what it meant to be single, created new economic and social niches that could be occupied by unmarried individuals. It altered demographic realities that influenced marriage prospects, and it fostered an urban environment where a wider array of personal life choices, including remaining single for longer periods or even permanently, became more common, if not always easier or uniprecedent. The monolithic idea of the unmarried began to fragment into a spectrum of single lives, each shaped by the powerful new forces of an industrializing world. This laid the groundwork for the even more complex and varied understandings of singlehood that would develop in the centuries to follow.